If the microphone is going well, I would like to start by saying that I'm very, very happy to be back in Moscow. There's no beginning of April that I'm not here, and I'm very, very happy that I can sit next to Irina. It's simply true that coming here once a year has become indispensable for my intellectual ecology. But I also want to do better each year, so this is why for the first time ever I have a tie on while I'm speaking. I hope you.
That's a great progress.
I hope you know this. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen very often. So the agenda for my lecture goes like this. I mean, some of you know that I'm obsessed by saying I have so many parts. This lecture will have, or this presentation will have 4 parts. In 3 parts, I will try to unfold the concept of anthropology, how I see it. I hope I get it more or less right. I mean, I thought I would talk at the beginning, relatively at the beginning, in the first segment here of this discussion, of this Banyi. So I thought it would be useful to give a mapping of the concept of anthropology, opening up certain possibilities. The first concept, I mean, before I do so, I will talk briefly about this intention of the humanities to describe the present. Is this legitimate? A turn, there's a turn. So what does it mean to talk about a turn? And then in part 2 and 3 I will unfold 2 different types of the concept of anthropology. There's a concept of anthropology, as we have already heard in the discussion, that tries to subsume the possibilities of what it is to be human in a very, very complex concept, but it is one concept. And then there's another possibility of understanding the concept of anthropology, and that would be precisely to go into an open horizon of differentiation. If you want to find out what humankind is, you have a variety of differentiations and there's no overarching concept. So these first 3 parts will be my attempt to give a mapping of what can be meant by the anthropological turn. And then, I feel a little bit like I play the role, if you forgive my language, of the party pooper here. Then I will say in the 4th part why I think that doesn't work. Why I think that doesn't work. This comes a little bit also from my discussion with my good friend and much admired friend, Kevin Platt. And in order to undermine a little bit this concept of anthropology, I will invoke the absolutely worst, especially for somebody born in Germany in 1948, and that will be Heidegger. So I will refer to two essays by Heidegger, or book one essay. One is The Principle of Reason, although The Principle of Reason is a very poor translation of der Satz vom Grund, because Heidegger plays with the double meaning of Grund in German can be reason and ground. And I will also, of course, refer to the famous or infamous letter on humanism from 1947. But let me talk briefly first about the question for intellectual contemporaneity. Is it legitimate or not? When we speak in the humanities, in the intellectual world at large, of a turn, like for example the anthropological turn, then we ask about the question, what is precisely contemporaneous in the humanities, and already implicitly give a positive answer to that. By talking about the anthropological turn, you make a claim that it is possible and important to say what's important now. Now, this question has often been challenged by other humanists, by other Geisteswissenschaftler, as you would say in German, by other scientifiques humains, by saying, well, if you want to know what's contemporaneous, you follow fashions, and following fashions is bad in the name of science. Science cannot be something that changes every year, so you have to have a continuity. So on behalf of a scientific conception of what it is to practice the humanities, this question for what is contemporaneous has always been criticized, but my first claim is that I think it's an absolutely legitimate question. Because in the first place, and I say it both seriously and ironically, I'm interested in fashion, I'm interested in what is going on, and I do think it is one of the most central, if not the central, task of the humanities and arts as a configuration of disciplines to find out each time what is contemporaneous. What exactly is the identity of the moment we are in. So I think absolutely this question, I mean, some people will say, well, we have all these turns and that is bad. No, I do think it is important to try and find out in each moment whether it is possible or not, what is the identity of the specific moment. Now it turns out that when we say anthropological turn, and we use the concept and the metaphor of turn, there are other metaphors by which we try to achieve the same. For example, in English, a similar question would be the question to say, what is the cutting edge? What is cutting edge today? Another question, or a similar question, would be, what is the paradigm today? The dominant paradigm today. So let me make a brief proposal how one can distinguish between cutting edge, paradigm, and turn. Three ways of trying to identify what is the intellectual present. I think when we ask, at least in English, what is cutting edge, we are asking, within an existing institutional framework, which intellectual option has the greatest potential for the future. So what we call cutting edge is not necessarily that which already dominates institutionally, but sometimes we talk about cutting edge when we think, what are young people interested in? What will potentially be dominant in 10, 15 years? This is what we're talking about when we're talking about cutting edge. When we're talking about paradigm, saying this is the paradigm of today, the deconstruction was the paradigm, the dominant paradigm of the 1980s, for example, then again, within an existing institutional structure, we do not ask so much what is the future, but what is now dominant? What fills the intellectual place now? What is the type of theory that gets you a position today, not in the future? Now I think one could easily show, but that would be a different lecture, that during the second half of the 20th century, and this is something special, there has really been a sequence, quite a regular sequence of paradigms that have occupied the central place in the humanities. Think of structuralism, think of paradigms like reception theory, think of deconstruction, think of new criticism and new historicism and so forth. And I think for the last 15 years, this sequence has somehow come to a stagnation. So after cultural studies, after identity studies that came up in the late 80s, we haven't had a continuation of that sequence. And I think this explains precisely what we mean when we claim that there's a turn, when we talk about a turn. I think when we say the anthropological turn, then different from talking about the cutting edge or talking about a paradigm, we do no longer speak within an existing institutional framework. We make the proposal that this framework should change for epistemological reasons. So for example, if I read Kevin Platt correctly, this manifesto, and I say manifesto in the positive sense, that was recently published in NLO, when he talks about the anthropological turn, when there's a talk about a turn, there's a claim implied that the structure of the disciplines, the institutional framework within which we discuss, should change. So in that sense, I think it is interesting that perhaps this frequency with which we use the metaphor of turn today, more than paradigm and more than cutting edge, has to do with the feeling that we need a new program at large for the humanities and arts as an institutional structure, not only an academic institutional structure. So I now come to my second and my third part, where I try to unfold two different versions of the concept of anthropology. The concept of anthropology has a very strange temporality, I think. As a concept, not necessarily as a signifier, I think it emerged in the 17th century and it immediately provoked resistance. In the 17th century there was already resistance against this concept, and despite this ongoing resistance, despite the fact that it has always produced attention, it has somehow tenaciously maintained itself until the present day. Anthropology as one overarching concept of what it means to be human. Now, why do I believe it emerged in the 17th century? I mean, For example, an anthropological concept in that sense would be Descartes' cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am, because it is basically the claim that the ontology of what it is to be human can be defined by reference to consciousness. The capacity of thinking, consciousness in a specific way, is what makes it to be human. Now, why do we have the beginning of this concept of anthropology in the 17th century? I think it has to do with the remoteness of the concept of God. I mean, we could also say that in this sense, the 17th century is the beginning of negative theology. That means the relationship to God, to define humans as creatures of God, is no longer enough. So you have to create an independent concept of what it is to be human, and this first independent concept goes by consciousness. So consciousness defines it what it is to be human. Whoever can think, is capable of thinking, is human. This concept obviously excludes completely the body, excludes completely the dimension of the soma, and it is from there that it produced resistance since the 17th century. And it is interesting in the sense that the first materialism that described itself as materialism emerges in the 17th century in France in resistance against Descartes, and this is Gassendi. And it continues obviously in the 18th century, the most eminent protagonist of this resistance being Diderot. Diderot, who's obsessed with the question how the human body, how the apparatus of the human senses enables us, or maybe not, to have an adequate, a realistic image of the world that surrounds us. So this would be my first and my second of 7 steps in which I briefly want to give you that history. It's really a quick step, a quick history. So there is Descartes, and immediately there's the resistance to bring back the somatic side, the body side, into a definition of what it is to be human. But an interesting thing is to observe that with this resistance, with Diderot, the question shifts. The question is no longer only what is it to be human. The question is that being human is now defined in relation to the possibility of producing an adequate image of the world that surrounds humans. So from the 18th century on, the question what it is to be human is dealt with within the subject-object paradigm. So what it is human depends on up to which degree being human is a capacity of giving an objective description of the world. And this, as a third step, precisely is the project of Kant. Yeah? Kant's critical work, the 3 critical books, precisely try to provide a definition of what it is to be human, and in that sense one could say they are an anthropology by trying to prove that being human has enough capacities to give an adequate image of the world that surrounds us. 4th step. So if we can say that since the late 18th century, the question of what it is to be human, the question of anthropology, is being dealt with within the subject-object topology, this question enters into a crisis in the late 19th century, and this crisis is the emergence of what we call in philosophy phenomenology, with a capital P. Not Hegel's phenomenology, but the phenomenology in the sense of Henri Bergson and Edmund Husserl. So what motivates phenomenology? What motivates phenomenology is the concern that perhaps what it is to be human, the mental apparatus of humans, is insufficient to give an adequate image of the world that surrounds us. So, and this is what Bergson and Husserl above all react against. So Husserl proposes, this is basically the operation of phenomenology, that by intense introspection we have to provide a complete concept of what the human mind is like, of how the human consciousness functions. And if we do so, we can then say how the specific structure of the human mind necessarily distorts our image of the world that surrounds us. But if we then know how the human mind distorts the image of the world that surrounds us, or structures the image of the world that surrounds us in a specific way, then we can, so to speak, subtract that effect from our image of the world and know what the world is really like. I think that is more or less a very brief but fair description of what the phenomenological project originally was. Now obviously, and this is the fifth step, this attempt to describe introspectively the general structures of the human mind leads to what has been called and criticized as the transcendental subject. The transcendental subject, the general concept of the subject. So this is basically what comes out, not necessarily out of Husserl's writing, but out of the phenomenological movement of the 19-teens and 1920s. And this is a fifth step, is the basis for a new type of sociology, what we call in German understanding sociology, a sociology that says that if we know what the human mind is in general, then this general description of the human mind must be the basis of humans being able to communicate, of humans being able to create a world. And this leads into what we call today constructivism. I mean, a book like the very famous landmark book, The Social Construction of Reality by Berger and Luckman from 1971, is a book that claims that based on phenomenology, based on a general abstract conception of the human mind, you can describe how the human mind creates its own world, creates its own environment. So we do no longer have to ask the question, what is the world really like? But it is enough to say that the human mind is this which creates the human world. Now, there's another philosophical conception based on phenomenology, and that's what's called in the German tradition Humananthropologie. Humananthropologie takes a different way of using the concept of the transcendental subject. Humananthropologie tries to describe humans to animals. That is the basic paradigm, to describe humans to animals, and the starting point is always paradoxically a negative one. Animals naturally, by the way they are born, have enough instincts to function within their environment, whereas precisely humans, due to their consciousness, don't function automatically within their environment. Thereby, the definition, the description of the function of consciousness is always compensatory. Consciousness, the specific human capacity, compensates for the human incapacity, the human inability to orient themselves within the human, the environment. So human anthropology, a relatively famous philosopher, more famous in Germany than internationally, Blumenberg, for example, based pretty much all of his books, of his writings, on this thesis that humans do not have instincts, and therefore all of human culture compensates precisely for this lack. Now, I've been saying that this very conception, since the 18th century, and then even more so in the 20th century, has been intensely criticized. You could write a history of the humanities based on different critiques of this overarching concept of what it is to be human, of this overarching conception of anthropology. One example, as there are several colleagues from Constance here, which is my alma mater, would be the eminent literary theorist Wольfgangom Izerem, who was saying reading literature challenges the human mind in an extreme way, and thereby describing literary communication is one very important possibility of complexifying this concept of what it is to be human. But let me switch now to my third part, which will be much briefer. I think it is obvious that this criticism of the overarching singular concept of human as a product of anthropology comes under intense criticism in the second half, in the philosophy of the second half of the 20th century, and I want to mention two such points of criticism. I mean, it's important to say at least once in the context of this colloquium that the first book, the first independent book, the first book that is not commentary by Derrida is precisely a critique of phenomenology in that sense. This is La Voie ou le Phénomène, where Derrida criticizes Husserl, criticizes the starting point of Husserl's phenomenology by saying it is an illusion to think that in a movement of self-reflection we can ever be successful in completely describing what human consciousness is. This will always remain a fragment. We can never fulfill this program of Husserl, this program of anthropology, this program of the transcendental subject. Any description, any self-reflexive description of the human mind will always necessarily be incomplete. I don't make a statement on whether I agree with Derrida or not, but I think it is important that this is a very powerful criticism of the conception of anthropology that articulates itself for the first time in 1967 when La Voie le Phénomène, Voice and Phenomena was published. The second efficient criticism of the conception of anthropology was rather articulated for ideological reasons. I mean, in the sense of critique of ideology. It is the suspicion that whenever we try to come up with a general conception of what it is to be human, we can only project our own particular conception of what it is human into this general concept. So general concepts of anthropology, of what it is to be human, would always and necessarily be too white, too Western, too male, or too Asian, or too female, but they could never really fulfill that promise of being general. Now this, I believe, has produced in the second half of the 20th century several conceptions of anthropology that do no longer opt for one highly abstract and highly complex, but always singular concept. This is anthropology, for example, in the sense of cultural anthropology, where you intensify the specific ethnic descriptions, description in plural, and the more different descriptions you have, the broader a variety you have of what it might be to be human. So I think the dominant conception in cultural anthropology in the Anglo-American context, different from the continental conception, does not go for one individual complex concept, but for a variety of possibilities of presenting what it is to be human. There is a similar philosophy which for moral or ethical reasons makes a similar point, and that is the philosophy of Levinas. In the philosophy of Levinas, the central topos is the face, the human face, and the human face is the central topos because it is something fragile. There's a fragility, a precariousness of the human face, because the human face precisely stands for the individuality of individuality of cultures that cannot be or should not be ever subsumed under a general concept. So I think in Levinas you have a move from the singular concept to plurality that is similar to the move that follows the deconstructive critique, but in Levinas it is operated for ethical reasons more than for reasons of epistemology. Okay, these are, I think, the two... 5 minutes, yeah, that's okay. With a tie I can do everything, actually. So, these are the two conceptions of anthropology I think we have ready here for discussion. This was the mapping. Now let me briefly say why, while I understand this proposal, and while I find this proposal fascinating, I don't think that, at least from my point of view, it is the most promising project for what the humanities and arts could be in the future. Let me briefly invoke, and I will not go into any detail, these two texts by Heidegger I was referring to. Why am I invoking der Satz vom Grund, the principle of reason? Because in the context of this very complex discussion, Heidegger's asking one central question, and this is the question, ironically similar to Derrida's question. How could we ever believe that the apparatus of the human mind is sufficiently complex to ever give an adequate picture of itself, so that the human mind, that consciousness could ever adequately describe itself? And how could we ever believe, this is even more dramatic, that the human mind would be sufficient to guarantee the individual and the collective survival of humankind within the environment? For me, this is one of those questions that once you understand it, you're saying, well, obvious, it is smashing the obvious. Why didn't I have this question in the first place? I mean, how could we ever believe that the human mind is sufficient to describe itself and is sufficient to describe human culture and maybe sufficient to guarantee the survival of humans individually and collectively? You could say the belief that this is possible is a remnant of a theological conception of the world, where God has given humans the possibility, for example, to have this perfect introspection. The other text that I wanted to mention is Heidegger's letter on humanism from 1947, provoked by the question of his translator and French admirer Jean Beaufret, who, like Jean-Paul Sartre, after 1945 thinks we have to revise the concept not of anthropology, but rather the concept that Jan Assmann was talking about. What is it to be human? Don't we have to be a little bit more pessimistic? Don't we have to argue in a different way now, after all the events, Gulag, Holocaust, and so forth, Hiroshima, I should say as an American citizen, of World War II? And instead of proposing his own new revised concept of what it is to be human, Heidegger undercuts this question by saying that what used to be human anthropology, this comparison of the subject-object topology with other animals, with other living beings, is precisely the inadequate question. He says the subject-object topology is how we will never understand what it is all about to be human, and what he tries to describe as an alternative is the late Heidegger's concept of existence, which always implies the semantic component of eccentricity. And that would be the description of Dasein, he doesn't say existence, description of Dasein, as being there to make possible, to facilitate the unconcealment of being. Being can only unconceal itself in the presence of Dasein, in the presence of humans, but it would be wrong to think that being unconceals itself as a message to humans. The unconcealment of being is not a revelation for humans. The unconcealment of being is not a message to humans. No, the unconcealment of being happens. The initiative is, so to speak, on the side of being. Humans have to be there for it to happen. Now, the final question is, why am I invoking this here? I'm invoking it because it problematizes in a double way the idea that there could be a general concept of what it is to be human, but also, and this is what I'm more interested in, because it problematizes the subject-object paradigm. That it is always the subject, the human side, that takes the initiative to describe, to know, to give an adequate image of what the world that surrounds it is like. All of a sudden, in this Heideggerian topology, the tables are turned. It is being that unconceals itself. Now, why do I find this interesting? I find this interesting for two reasons. Because in the first place, it would then be the task of being, the task of Dasein, the task of human existence, to be there for something to unconceal itself. And that which unconceals itself is something we cannot predict. We cannot predict. We have to be open for this to happen, but we don't know whether we will be able to think that which unconceals itself. But we have to be open. In that sense, I find myself relatively close, despite Impolsky's criticism of Heidegger, and I don't care much about Heidegger, I mean, after all, he was a Nazi, but about this openness. That is what I want to argue for. I have myself tried to define the task of the humanities as riskful thinking, meaning the humanities should try and think at every given moment that which cannot be thought within already existing institutional concepts. We should be open to think the unpredictable. We should be open to think that which is not part yet of a general conception. We should react to it by creating new concepts, by complexifying our conceptual possibilities. And I want to finish with two examples. Tomorrow my very long-term and very good and very much admired friend Aleida Assmann will speak. And as some of you or most of you will know, Aleida Assmann, in my view, more than anybody internationally, has developed the reflection about what collective memory is, in a specific situation in the most complex and most interesting way that I know. Now the point I want to make here is, maybe I misunderstand you, Aleida, or maybe you understand in a different way. I've never thought that you do that in order to fill out a pre-existing complex concept of what anthropology is, of what it is to be human. No, you did that, and we are the same generation, provoked by what had happened in German history. I'm not saying your theories are limited to that, but what I want to say is there you have an example for a very important philosophical reflection that is reactive in the sense to something that nobody could have predicted in 1925. In 1925 it was not clear that the project would ever emerge in such a way. Whereas I'm famous for being immodest, at least my wife tells me so, let me refer to my own work. This entire reflection that I've been trying to produce about presence, production of presence, was provoked by a cultural situation where most of us, and increasingly so, spend their everyday in a fusion of consciousness and software, so that the soma side of our life becomes more and more dysfunctional, and we don't know what to do with it. So in that sense too, my reflection on presence is a reaction to a problem, a philosophical reaction to a problem that could not have been necessarily anticipated when intellectuals, philosophers first talked about what it is to be human. And my fear or my position is that a beautifully outlined anthropological program for the humanities would freeze, would reduce, would take away that possibility of the humanities to do riskful thinking, to react to that, that in each given moment has been unpredictable and that all of a sudden emerges. Many thanks.
So, any questions, comments? Yes, I think it's natural we should react first.
Thank you, Steph, so much for extremely inspiring talk, conversational talk again. Let me pick up your last word, emerge. We met last when you came to Constance to give a lecture on emergence. And first of all, I want to point out that the emergence, the way you introduce it, is very different from the state of emergency. Of course, it's exact opposite. So I understood your lecture very much to be another version of this concept of emergence. And I think this riskful being open to what comes in the future, in the present, is very much what emergence is all about. I have two questions concerning the concept of human mind on the one hand, and then also human anthropology. I think these two things have been superseded. You haven't mentioned them, but perhaps we should put them into our picture by very close interaction now between natural sciences and humanities. Of course, we are supposed to speak about humanities here, but I think we cannot do it all on our own. And the tradition that you have invoked was exactly one in which philosophers decided to do it all on their own. Because Plessner and some of them were, go-betweens, but philosophical anthropology of that kind was more or less discarding the findings of natural sciences. Now we no longer have the concept of the human mind so much, because philosophers still do that, but we have the human brain. And when we look at that, what we are becoming aware is that we have this huge overlap with animals, and the point is no longer to tell us in which way humans differ from animals. Now the whole emphasis of all of this research is how they overlap, and that's what interests them. They're no longer interested in difference, they're now interested in sameness. And my question is, what does what kind of message is that for our own cause? And the second point has to do with the animals-humans relation, which is another take on the same theme. And here I'm also, I think you invoked Heidegger, one could also invoke Latour, because he is now arguing that humans and animals are not exactly the same species, but living in a co-social world and atmosphere. They're not absolutely divided. And from that point of view, of course, again, the whole notion of what it means to be human differs radically, and now we have many literary works and texts in which animal-human relationships are becoming more and more prominent. So my question would be, how does that dimension of our current research, both in the humanities and in the natural sciences, have impact also on your thinking?
Yeah, let me try and be, what I'm worst at, brief, just so that we can have time for discussion for other lectures. Two answers. In the first place, I do think that the entire current discussion that is open from the humanities side for the natural sciences try to include brain research in order to give a more complex concept of what it is to be human. I think it is the continuation and proof for that tenacity that I invoked of the paradigm of human anthropology. What I find so fascinating as a historical fact about this paradigm, it emerges as anthropology, it's not the word, but the concept in the 17th century. It immediately provokes strong resistance, but it has maintained itself until the present day, and by reacting to this resistance has provoked enormous complexity. And I think in that sense, the attempt to be open for the sciences is once again a reaction to certain resistance. This was the resistance to say, well, how can you even imagine to define what it is to be human without including the natural science, without including brain research? Well, then you open it up for that, like Latour, and you produce a more complex concept. Now, this is just on the historical side, where I think, if we had enough time to spell it out, we would agree and maybe produce together a pretty nice history, like one of those short books that we both like to write from time to time. Now, on the polemical side...
I'm ready to publish it.
Yeah, that's why we do short books now. On the humanities side, not on the humanities side, on the polemical side, let me give you an example for how one can see that research from two different sides. I would criticize it if you would say, in order to finally come up with a complex enough concept of what it is human, we now have to integrate brain research. Or brain research has made much progress, so in order to have this single, overwhelming, complex concept, we have to integrate brain research too. That precisely would be this kind of, in German I would say Malbuch, Ausmalbuch type of humanities, where you have a general concept that you progressively illustrate that I want to criticize, because that precisely takes away this, I think, specific capacity of the humanities to be reactive to specific situations. If, however, you say that under conditions, and these are historically new conditions of the human genome, that all of a sudden we may have this uncanny capacity of changing genetically what it is to be human, we have to have this discussion. So this discussion is not just an all-over discussion of trying to develop a general concept of what is human. but it is a discussion in which we try to react philosophically to one of the key challenges of our present, of this very present. Then I find it's an absolutely fascinating discussion. It would, of course, content-wise be the same discussion, but what I'm arguing is I want the framework of the humanities to be open, to be reactive to such things, because we do not know what will emerge in 5 years. I think, for example, Jan Assmann's discussions about monotheism and polytheism, about the different genealogies of monotheism, have not a completely, but a remarkably different value now with this destabilization in what we call the Middle East. So I want, not politically, not as political answers, but all of a sudden this question has a different context. And what I want to argue for is to keep up this reactive openness. I think actually a large part of what NNO has been publishing over the past 2 decades has been of high general value, but the high general value was so great because it was reacting to specific political and cultural situation in this country. And my fear is that if we do too much anthropology in the general sense, we close down and we freeze this possibility of reacting to things that are unpredictable.
Well, I would like to come back to your very first point, your reflections on turn. There's a connection between the very first part and the very last part of your lecture. This Heideggerian concept of unconcealment of being in the present. So perhaps there might also be some intellectual attention on our intellectual world, what's going on, what's coming, has some, I would say, affinities with this. But I'm also asking whether there's a connection between the very first part and the very last part of your lecture. This Heideggerian concept of unconcealment of being in the present. So perhaps there might also be something behind what's going on in the intellectual world, or behind these terms. So would you agree that there's a connection between your commencement and your end?
I mean, for those who, I think Jan and Aleida and I have been discussing now for 35 years or something like that. I hope you don't mind me saying that, Aleida, but it's been for that long. So, I mean, only after so long discussions, yes. That was exactly the idea why I had this overture talking about cutting edge, paradigm change and turn, and why I was affirming it is important to ask what's the present. Precisely because I wanted to say what's the present is not an easy question to answer, but an important question to answer. It had nothing to do with fashion in the bad sense. And the element I want to emphasize in Heidegger, the reason why I'm so interested in this very strange conception of unconcealment of being, is precisely the unpredictability of unconcealment of being. The idea, strange and counterintuitive as it is being that takes the initiative to unconceal itself, and it is not Dasein, it is not existence, it is not the subject who kind of drills a hole into being and finds out about being. And this, Jan, is exactly what I mean. The rest about Heidegger, I mean, we probably have very similar opinions, and I felt always embarrassed, especially if I'm not in Germany, to quote Heidegger. But this intuition, and you make the relation with ancient cultures, this intuition that it is not us who set the agenda, but something all of a sudden shows itself, and we have to be there to react to it. This is what I emphasize. And if anybody can prove me that this has an easy reconciliation with an overarching concept of anthropology, then I will be happy with anthropology. And I want to refer once again, I mean, I don't know whether we agree so much, but when Jimpolsky was saying radical indeterminacy, I felt an affinity there, because indeterminacy in the sense that what the agenda will be tomorrow is not clear. We should not have a general concept of what it is to be human, because that precisely would reduce our possibility to react to what unconceals itself tomorrow or today.
Marina, потом Kevin. Дальше потом.
Thank you. I want to go back to the genealogy of anthropology that you dropped it in your presentation. I absolutely agree that anthropology has emerged as a part of desacralization of the world. But again, from the 17th century onward, probably most explicitly in the 19th century, there was another very visible trend in anthropology which used the anthropology, physical anthropology, and the whole idea of physical anthropology was not only this focus on body, on somatic aspects of what is human, but also to elaborate a language of description of what is human, which is not determined by culture in any way, a kind of universalistic way to account for human experience without referring to culture, to consciousness, something that we today witness with this revival of interest in sameness between animal world and human world, brain research, and so on and so forth. So I'm not saying that physical anthropology is a valid field anymore, although as a kind of negative field of reflection for current anthropology is definitely persisting and very relevant. But if in the anthropological agenda this idea of liberating from predetermined meanings, from the language of culture remains, if this still remains part of anthropological methodology, I think it's very valid. It's something that can really help humanities to account for this indeterminate meanings and aspects of human experience. So I wonder why you reject this liberating aspect of anthropological method.
Because I'm just such a bad guy. No.
It's not.
Look, I would make a difference here. Also because I'm not all that powerful that whatever I say will become reality in the humanities. If I was King Midas, then it would be dangerous, but I'm not, clearly, unfortunately not, but would be good for humankind if I was. But the point I want to make is, it goes like this, that there are, of course, endless yields and products and traditions and books to be read, both from physical and from cultural anthropology. That I don't deny for 1 second. I also don't deny for 1 second that we're having an important discussion here. This is a very, very important topic. My reservation or my polemic is more specific. I don't want a concept of cultural or whatever anthropology to become the frame concept for the humanities. What I like, in a way, about the concept of the humanities is that it is so completely fuzzy. It is not clear. You can do many, many things, and it's not clear what you can do. There are no borders. What you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do. I fear if it becomes the frame concept for the humanities, then we have this agenda setting. This will be very, very good for German conditions, because you can write endless application for research money. You can say, well, there's field 23C that's not yet covered, let's have another Sonderforschungsbereich, right? That may be good for funding of the humanities in the state university system, but I feel it draws away our attention from what Jan and I were talking about. I don't even know whether we agree upon that, but this sensitivity to be there for something that shows itself that we hadn't anticipated it. That then, if something shows itself and you work on it, you can very productively work with certain results and certain achievements of different anthropologies that I don't deny for a moment. So I'm not saying throw out this entire tradition. I'm saying I doubt that it would be in the long run the most productive frame condition, the most productive frame conception for what we call the humanities and arts. So, but thanks. I think this is an important distinction that I didn't make in my talk, and that you provoked it.
Thank you, Sepp. I think this was an excellent, with the first lecture as well, beginning to our discussions. I wanted to return to this, the start of your talk, and let's talk about the turn, just because I think there's a slight sort of misconception there. Although I'm afraid that this is one of these questions which always ends up sort of claiming to be in agreement entirely with you, as I am. So it's not a very exciting polemic that I can offer you. But I think that the point of the turn thinking back the last like 20 years is not necessarily the suggestion of a new paradigm, which would be somehow an overwhelming new state of the field. It's just like when you say you want the anthropological turn, it's very different from saying that you need, to proclaim that now our new method is going to be historical materialism or whatever. At the turn, in history we had linguistic turn, cultural turn, etc. It really is about a positioning of one discipline with regard to another one, as a form of complexification and challenging of its own perhaps ossified methods and disciplinary standards. And that's, we could have the empirical term, we got all kinds of terms. Imperial term, we have an imperial term, of course. Right, so it's not necessarily with turn the suggestion that we're going to have is this dominating new paradigm, but in fact an anti-paradigm move with regard to one's own discipline. And I want to make a slight corrective, right? The term turn is arenas, although I like it very much.
I just got to speak a little bit, not so quick.
Not so quickly.
So because
all right.
I'm not sure that everyone, catches.
Okay.
So
my main point is
speakers.
Yes.
Sorry.
So the main point, basically, turn is about the destabilization of one's own discipline, not about the suggestion of a new framing discipline which has to come take it. The corrective that I wanted was about my article, which I don't think includes the term turn. My question was, why study anthropology? Not we should all become anthropologists. And I think we could talk in particular about the specific methods within the humanities which need destabilization. And I think we would probably come down in agreement on most of them. I remember, this is just going back to the personal anecdote, one of the first things you told me when you became
a student, I have to practice.
When you became my advisor was that the thing you liked best about comparative literature was it allowed you to do whatever you wanted. Which I'll rephrase, it allowed you to work on what you thought were the current necessary problems. And I think that the specific destabilizations that we need to carry out with regard to humanistic study relate precisely to the current conditions of our objects of study. The complete disintegration from our methodological standpoint of some of the specific structures which still hold our methods together. The sort of series of great texts which are still generations in a mode of close reading which relates to entirely nationalist conceptions of what the role of a literary scholar is. That's a method which still requires a certain kind of destabilization, despite the fact that the person who carries out this, writes the new dissertation on Tolstoy, fully agrees that what they're arguing against and what should be studied in Tolstoy is his own conceptions of national tradition and national identity formation. That there's a strange gap here between the comprehensions of the scholar and the actual methods which they are still using in order to carry out a specific intellectual project. And then one final note. I'm not an anthropologist, so I can't speak for anthropologists, although I want to ask the anthropologists if they can answer this. But it seems to me that the question of the relationship between the messiness of human experience and the need for research paradigms, which can always be shifting, and the necessity for research paradigms to have a certain kind of clarity and stability is one which repeats itself in our university institutions at various different levels as tensions between disciplines, which is to say that anthropology is similarly to the humanities located on a sort of a cusp between a messy material of human existence and a set of paradigms which continuously need to be disturbed and messed up, but that it's slightly differently sort of situated than the humanities are, which have always been, in fact, more fully identified with the object of study and therefore more fully identified with messiness itself. Sociologists, one step further removed, who think that they're going to somehow pull back from the same stuff that anthropologists are looking at and through a series of numbers and more specific structurally or methodologically defined terms have a better grasp on this cusp. And then you step back one step to economists, but that at each step it's this same cusp of destabilization of the paradigm by the messiness which has to be reproduced in order to have a robust set of discipline.
Thank you. Briefly, first of all, I think we do get, that's great, early on in the colloquium, we do get into a mapping now in the discussion. That's what I really wanted to achieve more than impose some proposal here, I mean, to provoke that kind of discussion. But two reactions. I think, yes, there's something we're in full agreement with, but you formulated it better. I exactly, like yourself, think when we're talking of a turn, we talk about the necessity to find a new institutional frame in which different disciplines relate to each other. It is precisely not a new paradigm. I mean, the pictorial turn or the anthropological turn, whatever turn you want to claim, or the linguistic turn even, I mean, if you refer to its consequences, does not necessarily imply any new paradigm. It just implies that we relate in a different way. Okay, so that we agree upon. My question is really not so much whether the anthropological framework would be a good one for the organization of the different humanities disciplines, but rather whether we need such a framework or whether it's a good thing for us to have such a framework. I remember one Stanford colleague once saying, universities are necessarily disorderly places. And then he said, because he was a dean, and therefore we have to impose order and have to structure it. But for me precisely, and I mean it in a serious way, not just to look kind of cool, and not because I will be probably the first professor who has been a professor for so many years as I have, and will never have been a dean. No, my entire life nobody ever voted for me to be a dean. I once voted for myself and it was only my own vote. So I have never had this institutional responsibility. So it's easy for me to talk, but that would be my question. Not only and not necessarily would the anthropological framework be the right one, but is it good for the humanities? And I come back for this unconcealment motif, and I don't care about the Heideggerian language, but this reactive capacity. Would it be good for us to have one? And I will make one argument why I think it would not. As soon as you have one, you can exclude intellectual possibilities in the name of something. See, for example, the reason why deconstruction has been so underdeveloped in Germany, so atrophically developed, was that you could always act against it in the name of Wissenschaft. You say, well, it is not scientific. I don't care about Germany, but as soon as you have a framed conception, you can say, this is not something you are allowed to ask money for. You cannot write a research application because that doesn't fit into the framework. Or, this is not allowed to exist because it doesn't fit into the existing framework. And I think precisely the strength of the humanities could be to have an indeterminacy in the positive sense.
Two more questions, and so we have the third one.
Thank you very much. I have one, probably two global question, but what do you think about such persons as Michel Foucault or Jacques Lacan, such French persons? Do their ideas have any interest for you, any perspective for you? Thank you. That's all.
That was a brief question. I mean, I can split it into two questions. I mean, you didn't really ask that, but I could answer the question. What do you think about French persons? Because it's such French persons. Well, I am actually, that gets largely forgotten, professor of French. And I did my last high school year in France, so I'm naturally Francophile, so I like French persons. But I want you to use both Lacan and Foucault to push and illustrate my argument. I think strong attempts have been made, and that could be documented biographically, to exclude what Foucault and what Lacan have achieved as thinkers on behalf of certain paradigms. Yeah? I mean, Foucault is not a real historian. Foucault is not a real philosopher. I mean, Foucault, after all, never was a quote-unquote normal professor in the French university system. Without Collège de France, would never have made it. And Lacan is even a more dramatic case. I mean, Lacan never made it within the... Of course, Lacan, one of the glories of French intellectual life, but Lacan never made it to any position within any institutional framework. Because you could always say, so, they were precisely strong because they were not doing their intellectual work within a paradigm. And then paradoxically, today, above all, Foucault has turned into a paradigm. You can be refused research money today because your research is not Foucauldian enough. But that's not Foucault's fault. And I want to keep it open. So I'd rather die very soon than see the day that people would refuse research money or dissertation or doctorates on behalf of my work. Say, no, this is not what Gumbrechт meant.
I would like to, as always, a very interesting talk. A short comment about Kant, that you are describing his anthropology basically in terms of transcendentalism. But we know quite well that he made his own anthropology, which is a very weird book, because it's a book which he stops to be transcendental. And he called this book exactly anthropology, and he's describing in the beginning of this book that he needs this anthropology because human being is richer than transcendental aspect. So there is something that couldn't be simply deduced. So they should be empirically described, and human beings are revealing something human in very empirical situations. So it's basically, we need empiricism to deal with the whole richness of human being. But what for me is extremely interesting is this idea of situation. Because the idea of situation is something which is very difficult to describe what is. It's not a kind of existential situation, of course. It's not Jasper's or assertion, something like that. So it's something in which human being is included. And by being included into some situation, it loses this purity of transcendentality of subject. So there is something that he's unable to describe in strict terms of his own critical philosophy, and he needs a new discipline to some extent to deal with remnants which are not describable from the point of view of highly developed theory. And maybe there exactly human beings are revealing itself in the most rich way, because exactly by being included into situation, human beings reveal its impurity. I am always responding to environment, I am always a part of a system that is never myself. This is why you cannot describe what is human being in terms of pure transcendentality of the subject. So fundamentally, what as Kevin was describing, this kind of turn, it's a turn toward impurity. So because all definition of theoretical, phenomenological, Descartian anthropology that you enumerated in your speech are always insufficient because they are not taking into consideration the impurity of empirical situation in which human beings exist. So fundamental disciplines are emerging as non-disciplines. Fundamental anthropology is exactly something dealing with human beings because it's not a discipline having its own epistemology or its own ontological premises also. Or it's a very kind of different kind of ontology.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, first of all, of course, as always in that kind of a talk, when you do this quick step, you're too reductive. I was referring to how Kant was institutionalized, so to speak. And of course, he was institutionalized as the main basis for transcendental subjectivity, for that concept. And you precisely insist, and I think that is one of the strengths of mid-20th century existentialism, this insistence on situation, this insistence of situation in the sense that situation makes things messy. And to illustrate that with Kant, because the protagonist I'm going to invoke is the only important contribution of my hometown, which is a university town, to the history of philosophy. As some of you know, Kant had a servant. His name was Lampe, which is a beautiful name for the servant of an Enlightenment philosopher. Now, Lampe, who was a war veteran, was a drunkard. He stole constantly, and Kant every day had the intention of firing. You cannot have, I mean, not only because he was losing money, but you cannot do that. But Kant saw himself incapable of doing that, because there was some attraction with Lampe. So one day, finally, Kant missed Lampe, and he fell into what we would call today a depression. And there's a note in his diary which is very beautiful: Lampe vergessen, forget Lampe, exclamation mark. I mean, this is the impurity of Kant, so to speak, that Kant should have been able to forget Lampe, but he could not.
So the last question.
Thank you. I found it very interesting, your philosophical discussion of the evolution of questions of what is human, and I share your ambivalence about a general description. And with you, I am ambivalent as well about what it would mean to take on the theoretical paradigms of a discipline which you characterized American cultural social anthropology as being a discipline that would define itself in terms of locating differences among humans. And I share your ambivalence, and for the sake of our ongoing discussion here, I would like for the record to clarify that as an anthropologist working now in a field calling itself a discipline, anthropology, this picture of anthropology doesn't correspond to anthropology as we know it. The paradigm of difference was heavily questioned since the 70s and into the 80s, and I would think that the goal of seeking or finding cultural difference or culturally defined categories among peoples is no longer valid within anthropology. So if we're going to talk about discussions between disciplines, it would be helpful if we can think about the actual current conditions of that discipline. So I'm hoping that will keep unfolding in the next days.
Well, thank you. First of all, I didn't know that, so it's important. So I will not say, oh yes, I knew that,
Yes.
and didn't have time to mention it. And yet, I mean, this is important to know. The and yet means that there was a time, however, as you were implying, when cultural anthropology was this insistence on difference. And I think there are neighbor disciplines, for example, my own, where this is what has remained, so to speak. I mean, if within literary studies today you invoke cultural anthropology, then you invoke this politically correct insistence on difference. And only if you understand difference, and in the end everything is only different, only then